Hello everyone and welcome to the other really awesome game from the semi-final match of the FIDE Grand Prix currently being played in Belgrade. It's Anish, Giri versus Dmitry and Andreikin, and first we covered the game between Rapport and MVL. You've seen that one ended very quickly. This one did not end very quickly, or rather it did, but it could have ended even quicker. But you guys will have to help out with this one. So it's one of those games that you don't believe what's actually in the game until you see it, and then you're like, well, of course, there's that, but it's easier if I just show you. So Anish has the white pieces, and he opens with e4. We have c5, Andreikin goes for the Sicilian defense, knight f3, e6, and now not the open Sicilian or anything like bishop to b5 or something like that, but rather b3. So this is the Vesterinen attack, and it's not a very common practice. So b6, Andreikin also wants to fianchetto his light square bishop. We have bishop to b2, bishop to b7, and knight to c3. So defending our e4 pawn while continuing development. Knight to f6, putting more pressure on the e4 pawn. So you can see, as white did not go for the open Sicilian, he goes for g3, fianchettoing the bishop. Black gets some very natural ideas of how to develop his pieces. So here we have e5, grabbing more space, challenging the knight, knight to e4, and here we have a trade. Knight captures, bishop captures, and now developing the queen with an attack on the bishop. So bishop moves, bishop to b7, and now there is a game where queen to e3 was played, but here Anish plays h4, and it is now already, as of move 9, that we have a completely new game. So let's see how Andreikin continues. Knight to c6. Again, this knight can always come to d4, for example, if you're gonna develop the queen on c7, maybe castle queen side, play king to b8, put the rook on c8, or maybe just even put the rook on c8, queen on c7. You can see how the knight coming to d4 might be useful, because if, let's say, knight captures, we're gonna capture with the pawn, we're gonna open up our c file. If white castles queen side, good things might happen for black. So here, Anish continues in the style of the modern neural network engines. He plays h5, wants to get that pawn all the way to h6, and now Andreikin says, I don't believe for a second in what you're doing on the king side. It's only move 10, your pawn is already on h5, I'm just gonna go knight b4. And now I'm threatening knight captures on c2, which wins the exchange, and also you can't castle queen side because your a2 pawn will fall. So how do you defend this? Well, Anish just plays d3. You could also strike with the d4, but Anish wants to keep the position closed for now. The queen now nicely defends the c2 pawn, and here Andreikin still not really interested in what Anish is doing on the king side, continues with b5. Now the pawn might come to c4, open up the position, and we could have a very open game. So a3, kicking away the knight, knight back to c6, and now queen to d2. It makes sense because the knight can come at d4 at any point, then the queen will be under attack. Maybe you're going to have to react by capturing the knight here, and the queen on e2 isn't really covering much territory. The queen on d2 covers a lot of territory and also makes room for the bishop to jump into the game if needed. So here, rook to c8, a very natural square for the black rook to be developed. Also, in the future, something like knight to a5, c4 might come. You want to break open the position. The rook will be very useful here. And Anish goes rook to h3. Now look at this, the rook can come to g3, put pressure on g7, the knight can come to g5, the bishop controlling this diagonal. So Anish is shifting all of his attention to the king side. We have queen to c7, Andreikin still not interested in what this queen side thing is, and Anish now just castles queen side. And now we have this very cool position, the black king still in the center of the board, which isn't really odd as the Sicilian was played. So how can black continue here? Well, here Andreikin goes knight to a5. He wants to put more pressure on that c4 square. Another way of doing things is to just play knight to d4. You already have a rook on c8, queen on c7, so you know the knight is beautifully placed on d4, and if white ever captures it, then you get to open up the c file, and this will of course be great for you in the long run. d4 pawn is not up for grabs because the a3 pawn would be hanging. So here, let's say f4, we just defend the pawn here, and the game continues. And black has a very good position. However, here knight to a5 was played, and now the game continues in a completely different manner. We have knight to g5 now, well, stirring a lot of trouble here. The knight might be interested in coming to e4 if challenged. And here, if you go to c4 right away, it's not really all that great. We can just capture once and play b4, and then the knight has to move, and nothing really fun happening here. Or you don't move the knight, you challenge white's knight, which is similar to what actually happened in the game. So after knight g5, bishop to e7, putting pressure on the knight, and then now comes rook to g3. So Anish still continuing with his onslaught of the king side, and now we have c4. Here, maybe h6 is the way to go, because then knight has to go back. For example, knight e4, bishop captures d, captures you nicely, double white's e-pawn, and now you strike with c4. And this is a little bit different than what happened in the game. Here, Andreikin strikes with c4 right away, and now we have d captures on c4, b captures on c4, and b4. And now how do you continue here? You know that if knight comes to c6, then the c4 pawn is just free. So what do you do? Or rather, even after knight to c6, we could go for h6. This could be even more interesting. And now black's pretty much busted. For example, bishop captures on g5. We're going to play queen captures, and after captures here, we're going to play queen here, attack the rook. Once rook goes to f8, now we play b5, and black is just out of any good moves. If knight e7, we play a4, defend our b5 pawn, open up the a3 square for our bishop to grab hold of this diagonal, and this will not end well for black. So this is why moving the knight isn't really an option. So here, Andreikin plays h6, and this is where the fun really starts. This is where the game can go really good for white, or it can go really good for black, or it can continue in many different ways, all depending on what you play. So feel free to pause the video here and try to find the absolute strongest winning move for white while I give you a couple of seconds. So for those of you who were able to do it, congratulations. I'm always thinking that the knight might have to go back at some point. And for those of you who just want to enjoy the show, knight captures on f7 is what Anish played. But this is not the move that we're looking for. But still, congratulations, as you've played a move that a very strong grandmaster played. The actual move that wins the game is knight to h3. And this is looking very odd. I mean, why would knight to h3 win the game? It's such a silly square for the knight. The point of knight to h3 is that black is without any moves here. The knight on a5 is hanging, and the pawn on g7 is hanging. Plus, if the knight moves, then the pawn on c4 is hanging. And once you combine all of that, there's simply not all that much black can do. Just to give you an example, of course, we're going to move the knight, otherwise we're just down a piece. We're going to capture on c4. And now, how do you react to this pawn being attacked? Well, let's say you castle. If you castle, queen captures on h6, and it's game over for black. That's just it. So we're not playing that. You could try rook to g8 to defend the pawn. Also not all that great. Once f4 is played, what move is there for black to play? If you can even spot one. Let's say you try a5, you want to bust open the queen side, start an attack. We just advance the pawn to b5. If knight a7, we can shift this rook over to c3. Not much for black to do here. So that's what happens after bishop captures on c4. So what you could do is maybe capture with the knight on e5, and it seems like, okay, we win this pawn, now it's going to be good for us. The problem is white can simply capture that, and after queen captures on e5, we can play queen captures on d7. Once the king moves, we're going to capture on b7, attack the rook here, and of course, now you might think, well, of course, the rook captures on c4, wins the piece back, but queen a8, and you get checkmated. There's no way out for black. Once you give up all of the pieces, then it's just a nice queen captures on d8 checkmate. Or if you don't capture the bishop on c4, you might think, oh, but there's queen to a1 check. Surely white cannot allow this. Well, in fact, white can allow this. Queen a1 check, king to d2. Let's say you try queen d4 check, just bishop d3. Let's say queen c3 check, you go king e2, queen to e5 check, king f1, and the king is perfectly safe on f1. White is up a piece in a completely winning position. You've shifted your king that castled queenside to now a king that's castled kingside, and safely at that, and there's really not all that much for black to do here. So here, after this h6 move, just knight to h3, and as the title suggests, sometimes you just have to relax a little bit, and you know, good things will happen, as black is completely busted in this position. But it's of course incredibly difficult to spot something like this in an actual game, because everything is hanging. You have so many ideas. Do you capture here? Do do you go back? How do you exploit the d7 pawn being weak? What's up with the knight on a5? Many things to consider, and Anish goes for knight captures on f7. Which is not a bad move. Of course, it's a good move. It's not just as good as knight to h3. So here, king captures on f7. We have to play this. And then now comes b captures on a5. And this is also not an easy decision for Anish, because how do you decide between this and queen captures on d7? To show you what happens after queen captures on d7, black captures, rook captures. And now, again, you can't move the knight because the bishop hangs on b7. So here, you might play rook h to d8. You want to force white to make a decision, but now white will happily go after rook captures on e7, give up the rook for bishop and knight, and after king captures, b captures on a5, and now you have this position. For example, king to f8, we have to guard our g7 pawn, and now let's say bishop to c3, we prevent the pawn from being pushed here. You get this position where black is up the exchange. However, white has the very strong bishop pair. You could play rook to g4, go after the c4 pawn. The bishop here nicely guards everything pretty much, and it's not going to be easy to utilize the rook pair as much as it will to utilize the power of the bishop pair. Also, the e6 pawn is very weak, so it would make sense to play something like this for white, but not an easy decision. Anish makes this decision, b captures on a5, and still it's very interesting. Now bishop to d5, black consolidates a little bit, and now we have queen to f4 with check. King to g8, king to e8, a little bit safer, but then again you are bringing your king to the center of the board. However, even just by looking at it, the king appears to be safer in the middle of the board than on the king side. Here, after king to g8, you are blocking your rook from entering the game, and that's never a good thing. But still, it's very hard for white to exploit this. Let's say you play queen g4, which seems to be the best move. How are you defending this? Your g7 pawn is hanging. This is the threat of checkmate. So, of course, we have to play rook to h7 to defend this. Now, this is an even sillier square for the rook. But now it's sort of impossible to find a move for white here. But not really. If you find rook to d4, then it all makes sense. It's such a wonderful move. Just asking what do you play here with black. Point is that if e5 is captured, then okay, you've grabbed the pawn, but you've also opened up this diagonal for the white bishop. We're just going to play f4. Once the queen moves, we can play rook to d2. Now open up this diagonal. Now we threaten to capture on g7. Also, you don't have to worry about this because the rook is also guarding the a3 pawn. So let's say bishop f8, defending this. Now bishop to e5, and it's again a very powerful position for white. That only white can win. Black can never win this, but it's of course incredibly tricky. Anish goes for a different line. It's also a super tricky line and a very enjoyable one. Rook captures on d5, where if the rook is captured, black just falls apart. If e captures on d5, then comes rook captures on g7 with check, and you are getting checkmated. King captures, you open up a discovery here with check. So what do you do here? You could move the king, let's say king g8, now you get checkmated, or you could try something like c3, you block the check, but then just queen to f7 is checkmate, of course. The h8 and h6 squares are not available to the black king. So instead, after rook captures on d5, it seems like black is completely busted. Probably why Anish went for this instead of a line like rook to d4, but there is bishop to g5, and this saves the game for Andreikin. Now the queen is hanging, you have to give up the rook here. Rook captures on g5, h captures on g5, and now how do you continue? The queen hanging and the rook hanging, what do you play? Two options really. You could move the queen, or you could capture on c4. If you capture on c4, then we trade down. Captures, we're going to capture on, not on c4, we're going to capture the rook, of course, with e captures on d5. Bishop captures with check, king f8, and now bishop to d4, preventing rook to c5. And well, it's a bishop pair against a rook pair, but white is up 3 pawns, so this will be incredibly difficult for black to play. Notice you still can't activate the rook, for example, by capturing on h5, because if white captures on a7, it's pretty much game over. You know that once you put those bishops on let's say b6 and b7, then all of these squares are controlled, and you can just start pushing your pass pawn. It will be impossible for black to stop this. So this is one way to go about it. The other one is what Anish played, queen to d4, giving up the rook this way. E captures on d5, queen captures, as the black king is wide open, so it makes sense you still want to keep the queens on the board. King to f8, and now bishop to d4, not allowing a move like c3 to trap the bishop. And now Andreikin just plays queen to c6. He says, all right, let's trade queens. I've had just about enough of this game. And there really isn't a way to avoid this, because the queen cannot go here, cannot go in this direction. So all the squares where you go to will just allow black to trade queen. So here best is just to trade right away. Queen captures, rook captures, and now bishop to e2, guarding the h5 pawn first. You could also capture on a7, but now the position is a little bit different, as the pawn is still on c4 defended, so you do not have access to the queen side with a light square bishop. So here we have a6, not allowing bishop captures pawn. Now king d2, we have to bring our king to c3 to prevent this pawn from being pushed. We have king to e7, finally allowing the rook to enter the game. King to c3, and now rook to b8. Here we have a4, not allowing any rook to b5 ideas, but still there really aren't all that many squares for the rooks to use. Rook to b1 looks nice, but now bishop to f3, and now everything is guarded here. There is nothing for the black rooks to attack. Absolutely everything is guarded. And of course, if you play something like, or rather it was in this position that the players agreed to a draw, as there is pretty much nothing to try here. Also, they're very low on time. Anish has some 3 minutes on the clock. Andreikin had 2 minutes on the clock, so it would be, well, maybe best to just wait for tomorrow's game and see who will do better there, because 7 more moves until time control, anything can go wrong for either player. Maybe rook to a1 seems a little bit interesting going after this, but then the rook just hangs on c6, so there's really not all that much you can do here. So yeah, that's the game. Hope you guys enjoyed it. Always when in a critical situation, maybe, it's of course easier said than done, but sometimes it's best to just relax here. Once you see it, knight to h3, after h6, knight to h3, then you can see that black has no moves, and it's just a, a terrible position black got himself into. And by forcing this knight captures on f7, you've actually allowed black to even have moves. Otherwise, black doesn't have any moves. So yeah, maybe something that we can take from this game and maybe try and apply in your own future games. So yeah, once again, hope you guys enjoyed it. We're continuing today with round 2 of the FIDE Grand Prix semifinals. I would like to thank Zulon, Closebox.com, Lucas Teokaris, Jonathan Lay, and Dave Austin for your contribution to my channel. Thank you a lot. I really appreciate it. As usual, you can check 2 of my previous videos here. Thank you all for watching, and I will see you soon, continuing the coverage of the Grand Prix until it finishes. So thank you all. I will see you soon, and have an excellent rest of your day.